Hello, everybody. I must say I'm tempted to say on behalf of my disenfranchised English colleagues, it's great to be here amongst so many Europeans. But please don't blame us. Okay, I have a paper to present, and I will try and stick to it because that's what I agreed with the organisers of this wonderful event. But I will from time to time diverge, maybe with a few little asides. Much of what I am going to say is quite reflective and quite personal in a way, and I'm going to express opinions. Opinions are still valued, fortunately, at the moment in educational research, and I think that's something we should never forget. It's perhaps appropriate that we're here today in a debating chamber, because debate has been at the heart of the developments many of us have contributed to and tried to make in the field of education. So I am going to be reading much of this, simply because my colleagues here at ECER wanted a paper. So let's begin. Okay, so the presentation that I have come here today to make in this elegant and what I think of as quite gritty city of Glasgow is based on a number of premises. When I declare what these are, you may possibly find yourself in agreement with much of what I have to say. On the other hand, you may choose to disagree or even to dispute some of my suggestions. That is indeed your prerogative, and I would defend your right to do that to the end. These kind of principles are important to those of us working in the field of educational research. So my first premise is that good educational research has a large element of utility. That is, that if it serves any purpose at all, and hopefully we all believe it does, it is that through attempting to produce structured and disciplined approaches to understanding what happens when considering those phenomena that influence the education of individuals, groups, communities, or whole societies, we have a role to play. This may involve, for some of us, an attempt to investigate the influences of policy, of pedagogy, or any of the many conditions that impact and shape the lives of those for whom we, as researchers, express our concerns. I would argue that without such utility, that is, without our ability to relate what we do to the everyday lives of people and the commitment of those engaged in education, we are failing in our responsibilities as researchers. If we conduct research in isolation from the people we express our concerns for as educators, then we are doing a disservice to a large part of the population. My second premise is that we begin our work from a position of great privilege. Each one of us gathered today in this room has had the benefit of a good education. While we're undoubtedly grateful for this education and to those teachers who have guided us to gain our current status, I suspect that many of us believe that the education we have gained has been our right. Would that this were so for everyone in the world. I have no doubt that there are times when all of us, and I count myself definitely within their number, see fit to complain about the systems and organisations within which we work. There is indeed much that could be improved to support the lives of educational researchers. However, I feel that it is right that we should make time to pause and to consider the situation in which we find ourselves. A truth which is all too apparent in the research and development work in which I continue to engage is that there are many living within our world who have been and continue to be denied the educational and social opportunities from which every one of us gathered in this room has benefited. Furthermore, in addition to the privileges that have come to us through our education, the majority of us here live in the relative safety of knowing that we can express our ideas and opinions without fear of oppression or reprisal. I say the majority. There are people I've met at this conference who do not feel that they're in that situation. And that's something we should be deeply ashamed of in the kind of societies that we've created. This is not the case for all of our colleagues engaged in education and research around the world. And as Professor Artiez, in his challenging presentation yesterday, reminded us, every one of us needs to remain vigilant and active to ensure that such rights and privileges are defended. It's not my intention to elicit any feelings of guilt amongst this assembly through anything that I may say today. Indeed, if such were my purpose, I would raise my own hand as one of the guilty. It is, though, my hope that in today's presentation I may provoke some thought about what it means to conduct our work as researchers with respect for those with whom we engage, and by accepting our responsibility to see research as a process of development rather than an end product in itself. So I have my title on the screen here. Does this title imply a problem? For me, this is a very important and fundamental question about what we do. I honestly believe that as educational researchers, particularly those sitting in this room who've made a commitment to travel to this conference, to share and engage in ideas, nobody actually goes about their task in an irresponsible way or a disrespectful way. But I do think from time to time, we need to just think a little bit about the processes that we engage in, to actually question the ways that we work, and maybe to reflect on where we've come to and how we've got here. So, in the field of education, many researchers continue to be motivated by a desire to understand those factors that have led to marginalization and educational exclusion of certain groups. The experiences of individuals, for example, with disabilities, those from some ethnic minority groups, others who live in poverty, an increasing number around the world, or whose cultural backgrounds or lifestyles challenge the conventions and norms of society, continue to face prejudice and discrimination. As researchers, we like to feel that we can make a difference by presenting data that shows the experiences of such groups and challenges preconceptions regarding their abilities, aspirations, and life experiences. In recent years, the use of terms such as emancipatory research, feminist inquiry, participatory action research, and the promotion of critical theory has made a direct link between the use of research data and the desire to effect change. In this presentation, I'm certainly not questioning the honourable intentions of researchers who have worked within these approaches. I would suggest that the competitive nature of the current research environment in which many of us operate may, however, militate against the best intentions of those who are committed to promoting research as a more equitable process. I put these figures on here, and I don't know, but there may be people sitting in this audience who work in the institutions from which I've taken these documents. But many of us now work in an educational environment which has turned us into competitors, one university against the other, one researcher against the other, and has actually created an atmosphere in which we have been driven to conduct the kind of research that is going to reflect well on the institutions in which we work. I think those of us working within the UK are very conscious of the decisions that are made today by universities about the kind of research they want to support. And sometimes that research, I would suggest, means, or that attitude, I would suggest, means that research in some areas, which could be beneficial to the communities in which some of us try to work, is actually sidelined in favour of those projects that bring in more money or more prestige to the institutions in which we work. Understanding that all our intentions as educational researchers are honourable, it is my intention during this very brief session to suggest that there may be a need to review the ways in which the complex relationships that exist between researchers and those who are the subjects of research are currently perceived. If research is genuinely intended to have social benefits and to support processes of change, it may be advantageous to consider opportunities to enhance partnerships that strengthen the relationship between inquiry and practice. The greater involvement of those individuals who own the data that we as researchers seek to gather and kindly entrust to us to interpret and understand may in some instances be desirable if we are to be sincere in our commitment to achieve greater inclusion. You'll notice there I talk about ownership of data. All of us are dependent upon the people at the heart of our research to provide us with the data that we need. It's their possession. Their experiences, their understanding of the factors that impact either positively or negatively upon their lives, upon access to learning, for instance. They're their experiences. This data belongs to them. And it is my belief that they loan it to us to interpret fairly and to use in a responsible manner. This is all part of my agenda here in today's talk about the way we conduct research in a respectable manner. Our understanding of the causes of marginalisation and discrimination based upon a long period of research is greater than it was in the past. The research conducted in this area has been extensive, well-focused, and often important in shaping educational policy and practice. And indeed, looking out on this room, I can identify a number of people who have made a substantial contribution to this field of inclusive research and inclusive education. Yet, when I look at the current situation for many of the most disadvantaged peoples in our societies, I have to say I see little progress. And indeed, I would contend that for much of the world's population, including here in Europe, their position has worsened. It may therefore be pertinent to suggest that for research to maintain its currency in the immediate future, we may need to consider the ways in which those who have been excluded in the past are assisted to shape their own more inclusive future by a more direct involvement in the entire research enterprise. In a long career, pointed out by the chairman, very delicately I thought, working as a school teacher, school principal, schools inspector, university academic and researcher, I have witnessed many changes and new directions of the education initiative. Working within a state education system that is invariably driven by changes in societal expectations and the vagaries of national economic and technological innovation, we should, of course, expect that the demands made upon educators change, and the need to be flexible and responsive to these demands is essential. Having commenced my days as a teacher in the 1970s, I have been fortunate to see many education innovations that have improved the lives of children and their families in several parts of the world. This is self-evident when I see countries in which education attendance has improved, where there are more children going to school than there were in the past. But that doesn't mean that we can be complacent. I would suggest that despite the intentions of these changes to promote equity and inclusion, for much of the time, rhetoric has ridden roughshod over many of the efforts made by teachers to ensure the delivery of better opportunities for those young people who remain on the margins. We live in an age of sound bites, social media, quick statements, the kind of thing which often has very little veracity, little evidence in research-based truth, for instance, or research-based ideas. So, we're very aware that changes have taken place, but we're all driven by an agenda, and that agenda may actually lead to those who are maybe our political masters using facts and figures to shape their own ideas rather than relying on the kind of research that we supply. And this is a challenge, I think, for all of us as researchers. How do we actually confront the kind of information that many members of the public depend upon? Most of my years working within education have been focused upon the area of what was traditionally referred to as special education. I used to be described as a teacher of children with learning disabilities or learning difficulties. When I was school principal, I used to tell my staff that no, that's wrong. We are actually teachers with teaching difficulties. The difficulty is we don't know how to address the needs of all of these children in our school. And therefore we need to investigate, we need to try things, but we're not going to make bold statements about our successes until we've gained some evidence. And that's always been important to me, the notion that we do things on the basis of evidence, not following some current trend. Education, or special education, was that which had the intention to improve the opportunities afforded to those who had difficulties with learning or experienced levels of disaffection or discrimination within both the education system and wider society. In recent years, the term special education has often been superseded by the more acceptable notion of inclusion, a theme to which I'll return shortly in this presentation. Effective teachers, of course, are also effective learners, and I hope that my long years of experience working both in the UK and internationally have taught me about the necessity to challenge the complacency that has come to characterise much of the rhetoric around education and its development. That is not to say that I question the motives of my hard-working colleagues and associates, including those who sit before me in this audience today. But I know that many who work for the benefit of young people who experience difficulties have far too little time for reflection. Working as we all do under the pressures of a system that has, for the most part, become reactive and feels the need to be seen to respond to every new policy initiative or political statement that impacts on the teaching profession. Reaction has become the norm within education, as we all know, certainly in this country, from the knee-jerk reactions that we get from policymakers to attempt to deal with problems of which they have very little understanding. In addressing this esteemed audience of educational researchers gathered here in Glasgow, I'm conscious of the concerns that many of you will have, not only to be doing research, but also to be demonstrating the quality of your work to various research councils, funding bodies, and, not least, your own institutions, universities. The expectations of such bodies are, of course, significant in terms of their influence, not only upon what we do as researchers, but invariably impacts upon how we conduct ourselves as researchers and the funding that is made available for further inquiry. There appears to exist in the minds of many influential administrators and funders a rigid view of what constitutes good research, how data should be collected and interpreted, and how the findings of investigations should be presented, and who to. This view has indisputably been developed over a good number of years and has been endorsed by many experienced and well-respected researchers who have quite rightly been acknowledged for the quality of their work within these expected frameworks. But perhaps, at times, we have accepted too readily that the practices of the past always hold good for what we do today. In this brief presentation, I only have time to raise a few questions about recent patterns in educational research. But I hope I may thereby provoke some debate about both our current activity and some of the ways in which we may move forward in the immediate future. A perusal of educational research journals over the past 40 years provides evidence of a significant focus upon investigations related to special educational needs, disability, exclusion, and marginalisation. In many respects, I regard this to be a positive indication of the concerns that educational researchers have towards a population of learners who have long been disadvantaged within our education systems. Of equal interest has been the methodological shift of approaches adopted by researchers working in this area. Like I suspect many of the older researchers gathered in this august assembly today, possibly even one or two older than me. My earliest training as an educational researcher focused heavily upon quantitative research methods, whereby we were concerned through the use of standardized measures and well-defined statistical procedures to apply measurement and numerical indicators to the investigations that we conducted. All of us starting with the basics of distribution and concepts such as correlation, reliability, and validity. As students of educational methods, eventually were encouraged to consider such heady concepts as regression, product moment correlations, or come to terms with Roche theory or Cronbach's alpha. I well recall myself an afternoon in the early 1980s using pen, paper, and printed tables, some of you probably won't remember what they were, to complete analysis of variance using a chi-square procedure on a large sample presented to me by an eminent professor from Bristol University, a great man, sadly no longer with us. Most especially, I remember feeling particularly anxious about the high probability that I may make an error of calculation. Of course, in later years, this whole process was simplified by simply entering the data into the statistical package for social scientists, SPSS, pressing buttons, and out came the results. There was a period in my career, though, I have to say, when Derek Rowntree's excellent text, Statistics Without Tears, was never far from my side. though I confess at times I was almost brought to tears as I wrestled with the various statistical concepts. Of course, in education, in that period when I trained, we talked about 3 disciplines in research in this field. And those of us who trained as teachers at that period had to have passed courses in each of these: psychology, sociology, and philosophy. I see some people nodding in the audience here. But then education received some respect as a discipline in its own right. And I think this was a terrific move, because education was not seen as a discipline in the way it is today. Education was something that teachers did, but it had no real scientific basis unless it was through those 3 channels of psychology, sociology, and philosophy. And I have to say, it's through people who came through an educational background that many of the advances in educational research have taken place. I would issue a word of warning here to my colleagues in the UK. That discipline is being eroded, and we will soon only receive funding for educational research based upon psychology, sociology, and philosophy. And philosophy, hardly any. Today's educational researchers, and certainly those working in my own particular area of inclusive education, are much more likely to conduct investigations that are heavily weighted towards qualitative approaches. There are, I would suggest, very good reasons for this, though I would continue to advocate that effective researchers develop a good understanding of both qualitative and quantitative methods in order to make sound judgments about the methodological decisions that they make. Educational researchers coming new to this field may be forgiven for finding difficulties in negotiating a pathway through both the concepts and the language that we have attached to the framework whereby we conduct our investigations. The term paradigm is often loosely used today in an attempt to narrow and justify the approaches adopted by researchers. And those coming new to the field may be forgiven for some confusion in locating themselves within this vague roadmap of paradigms. In 2006, Mackenzie and Knipe produced a table intended to assist researchers in negotiating the maze of terminology that is often used to describe the research process. The extent to which they succeed in this venture, I will lead you to decide. I've had discussions of this table with PhD students on several occasions. Whether they leave the discussion enlightened or confused, I'm often unsure. For many of us working in the field of special education and inclusion, the move away from research approaches dominated by largely positivistic approaches has been welcomed in one particular respect. The samples of individuals for whom we have expressed our concerns tend to have been amongst those who have been discriminated and marginalised. In some of the earliest research conducted into their lives, they tended to have been reduced to numbers. Their individuality and personalities have been denied, and their lived experiences largely ignored. As a researcher who spent many years teaching in schools, I knew that what I wanted to obtain from those conducting investigations was concrete ideas on what I might do to become a more effective teacher, and thereby to support those learners who were experiencing difficulties. Reports of research in my early teaching career, much of which had been expertly conducted, simply provided me with statistical evidence, for example, of the linguistic development of children with Down syndrome and how far they fell behind their typically developing peers, or about the perseverative behaviour of infants on the autism spectrum. These papers were certainly of interest to me, but in terms of the help they offered to me as a teacher, they were very limited. Sadly, they gave me little understanding of what I, as a teacher, might do to address the issues that confronted me. Furthermore, such studies were often couched in language that was accessible only to others who had received training as researchers, and therefore excluded many teachers, parents, and others whose commitment was to improve the lives of those children at the core of their research studies. Examples of some of the complex language we use every day as colleagues. A very limited code, I would suggest. A move to undertake research that is more respectful to both the subjects of investigation and those who work or live with them has certainly been welcomed. The establishment of closer links between researchers and the subjects of research has enabled greater engagement with processes of investigation and the promotion of things like action research, for example, which is built upon the earlier work of people like Lewin and progressed by people like Whitehead and Lomax, McNiff, Elliott and Melanie Nind. And this is endeavoured to put teachers and other professionals at the centre of the research enterprise. Increased research for teachers in the conducting of research has generally been welcomed, though the pressures upon schools and the challenging role of being a classroom teacher inevitably means that it is unlikely to develop much beyond its current place as a process undertaken by a minority, for example, teachers doing postgraduate courses. However, alongside this increased partnership between researchers and teachers, it is possible to identify a further welcome trend, that of being respectful in listening to the voices who are those of the subjects of our investigations. There's been much literature, much campaigning, much research conducted, obviously, in this field. Campaigners who have worked in the field of disability rights and others from discriminated groups have often expressed frustration at their inability to make their voices heard and have seen this as a significant exclusionary factor. I would refer you to the work of people like Mike Oliver and Tom Shakespeare, for instance, to understand their anger about the exclusion that they've experienced in the past. If inclusion is a critical issue for schools, then it must surely be of equal concern to us that we ensure that those who have traditionally been excluded are having their voices heard. And this may be an important starting point in recognising the unique understanding of their own situation and providing us with understanding of the lives of young people with special educational needs and their families. Some researchers have made great progress in this area, ensuring that voices may be heard. I look at the work, for instance, of Lewis and Porter or Vlasov and Papanao. This has been a positive move forward. But it does seem to me that it should be regarded as no more than a first step towards achieving a more inclusive and equitable approach to researching the lives of those for whom much of the research claims to be concerned. In 2003, for example, my colleague Professor Michael Shevlin from Trinity College Dublin and I worked together on the Encouraging Voices project. We thought Encouraging Voices was a clever title. We wanted the voices we heard to be encouraging, and we wanted to encourage voices from these people we worked with. This was initiated and funded by the National Disability Authority in Ireland. But they were very flexible when we said we weren't just interested in disability. During this period, our discussions not only with individuals who'd experienced disability, but those from other marginalised communities, increased our understanding of those similar factors that have impacted on their lives and led to exclusion. Not only from education, incidentally, but from many aspects of social engagement that the majority of us take for granted. The publication that resulted from this project included chapters not only written by people with disabilities, but also those from the Gypsy Traveller Roma community, refugees, young people who've been bullied at school or excluded from the education process. The book was well received, and Michael and I have continued to work on this principle of listening to voices throughout the years since it was published. We haven't always got it right. Many times I feel we have done a disservice to the people we have tried to work with. But that doesn't mean to say we should give up. As, to quote the words of the great Nobel Prize winner Samuel Beckett, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. Having pursued this approach to our work as researchers for more than 20 years, and noting how others, not only in the area of inclusive education, but also, for example, in nursery and early years education, and in the education of refugees, have adopted a similar stance, we believe that considerable progress has been made in this area. Furthermore, discussions in the academic literature have provided sound advice on how interviews with vulnerable people can be conducted. However, having advocated listening to the voices of marginalised individuals for an extended period, we would now suggest that a number of critical questions need to be asked and issues addressed. While we're not questioning the motives of researchers who use this approach, particularly having done it ourselves, we do feel that it's important to ask, what does the use of voice mean? To what extent are these voices representative of a wider population? And how assured are we in our ability to apply meaning to what we hear? When as researchers we interview or seek the experiences of those at the hearts of our studies, what are our responsibilities? I have no doubt that in following this procedure, our motives are genuine, fired by a desire to understand and possibly thereby improve the lives of those who continue to be marginalised. But surely our responsibilities must go beyond this. And perhaps now is a good time to look at the whole process of gaining and reporting the voices of others. In the methodological sections of much of the research reported, attention is given to the collection of data through interviews, for example, with children and young people. This is indeed an area in which we've seen a great deal of innovation with the effective use of pictorial methods, technology, for instance. And the honourable nature of this research is not in question. But it does appear from reading reports of research that in most instances, having collected the data in this manner, the involvement of the subjects of research is terminated. They are no longer a part of the research process. They have lent us, in my words, their data. We have used it to report. Thank you very much. How often do they actually go beyond that stage of our research process? Once collated, interviews are, of course, transcribed, coded, and analysed in order that the findings may be elicited and reported. This is, of course, a step forward from a time when the opinions and experiences of young people were seldom considered to have any value in informing research. But now, perhaps, we might consider how the relationship between researchers and those whose lives we aim to illuminate might be further extended for the benefit of both parties. This might best be achieved by considering the stages through which research generally proceeds. In any research project, the identification of a viable and relevant sample is important. In instances where the research questions are concerned to understand the impact of educational policy, procedures, or practices on the lives of young people, it is legitimate to ensure that their experiences are recorded. As I've demonstrated, this has led to this increase in efforts made to obtain their voices. However, I believe that rather than seeing this as an end to involvement, we might consider this as being a first stage of their involvement within the whole research enterprise. Having collected, coded, and analysed the data, how confident can we be that the words that we have heard from the voices gathered have been accurately interpreted? In a critical review of interviewing as a data collection method, Al-Shankiti asked questions that are pertinent to this issue. One of these refers to the challenges of conveying meaning. Al-Shankiti suggests that interviewers are generally clear about the meaning they intend to convey through the questions. However, we should acknowledge that an alternative interpretation may be made by the interviewee. This situation may be further exacerbated, of course, in situations where the interviewee may have a limited vocabulary, be responding in second language, have a learning difficulty, or feel stressed by an unfamiliar interview situation. Might it be advantageous, for instance, to return to interviews with transcripts and to involve them in the coding and analysis process? I hear some people saying coding, thematic analysis, a really complex issue. It is. But on the other hand, if it is complicated, perhaps we would all benefit by being able to explain it to the people whose data we have borrowed, to involve them, to see how we're actually managing their data, and to be respectful in the process that we go through in coding. Now, I can already hear some of you saying, what about the time? And you're quite right. I'm not here suggesting that this would be possible with entire samples, but achieving some level of verification through a further discussion with the individuals involved may be illuminating and may prevent the possibility of misinterpretation. Furthermore, such a process of checking may increase the confidence of the subjects of the research, both in terms of the process and the researchers undertaking the work. This is not in any way suggesting that primacy in respect of interpretation should be taken away from the researcher, who after all has had training in this field. In any good piece of research, efforts will be made to triangulate the data, often through other means of data collection, for instance. What I would like to suggest is that by returning to the original sources of interview data, the researcher is demonstrating respect and providing a greater opportunity for verification of what they're saying about the data. For example, throughout a longitudinal study of provision and the experiences of young people with special educational needs in Ireland, which I was privileged to work on with my colleague Professor Michael Shevlin and others, we returned at regular intervals to our sample schools from which we'd collected data. We sat with teachers and went through their interviews and showed how we'd coded it and what we thought it meant. We did the same with children and with parents. And there were times when they said, no, you've got completely the wrong end of the story here. This isn't what we meant at all. And we were able to check through other data that we had as well to see whether we could be more accurate in reflecting the information that we had been provided. Now, I'm accepting that's a time-consuming approach, and I know that people who fund research give tight deadlines. Institutions want you to get to the end of this project so you can bring in money from the next one. But actually, I would suggest that if we are responsible as researchers and respectful of the people we research, we need to do far more of this kind of activity. Of course, on completion of research, it's usual to issue a report. The nature of such reporting is generally dictated by the requirements of those who commissioned the study and is written according to the needs of a specific audience. To what extent, I wonder, is the accessibility of such a report considered as a normal part of the research process? Whilst ownership of research findings quite rightly becomes the property of the commissioning agency, should researchers not have an obligation to those whose data has been entrusted to them by the subjects of research? Dissemination of research has too often been seen as a means of sharing information between researchers and with policymakers and others who authorise their work. Consideration given to the accessibility of research has seldom been prioritised. It has often been stated that teachers do not make use of educational research, and there's some evidence to suggest that this is true. In a thoughtful discussion of teacher appreciation of research, Durham, Gabrielle and Walton identified a significant distance between the perceptions of the value of research held by researchers and teachers in schools. Not least was the view that the presentation of research lacks accessibility and that it has failed to develop a viable platform for discussion between researchers and teachers. Might the same be said in relation to the accessibility of research to those who are currently the victims of marginalisation, those with special educational needs and disabilities, for example? I'll give you a concrete example of this, of a school principal in the authority where I'm based and where I myself worked as a school principal, who was sent a paper by a researcher based on some research that had involved her school. I happened to go and visit the school and she said to me, can you explain to me what standard deviation is? And what are all these funny shapes and figures within this paper? I would say it was disrespectful of that researcher to send that paper to the school. The researcher should have gone back and spoken to that head teacher in plain English. We've developed a code which we share amongst ourselves, which is like a foreign language to many others out there, and we need to address that as an issue. There are, of course, very good examples of researchers returning to the sources of their data to present a researcher findings in a manner that is accessible. But this is far from the norm. Perhaps it is time for researchers who believe that they're working towards a more inclusive society to reconsider how they ensure that those upon whom they are dependent for their data may be able to see the outcomes of their research. To give one example, a good colleague of mine in India, Professor Janti Narayan, always produces a recorded report of the research she does in local languages for people to be able to access and understand how they've shared in this process. So, coming towards a conclusion now. The inclusion agenda has made significant progress in recent years, and researchers have made a major contribution to how our understanding of the lives of individuals, those with special educational needs, those from disadvantaged groups, may be improved. Now is not the time to rest on our laurels. As researchers, it is beholding upon us to set an example to the wider educational community by demonstrating our commitment to ensure greater involvement of those who have been marginalised in all aspects of our work. And I'm sad to say sometimes I think of teachers today as a marginalised community within our societies. Such a commitment will face obstacles, but the rewards to be gained by creating a research environment that is more inclusive may well go some distance towards ensuring greater credibility for the work that we undertake in the eyes of those for whom we express concerns. By demonstrating respect for those on whom we rely for the data that we use, I would suggest that we are more likely to gain greater respect for ourselves as researchers. Thank you very much.